Chapter 2. Walter cautiously followed the professor as he descended a tight spiral staircase down a dark and narrow shaft. The walls were poured concrete, smooth to the touch, but so confined it made him feel claustrophobic. It was also quite dark, so sparsely lighted that he had to feel with his foot for each step. Its only saving grace was that it was well ventilated, with a cool breeze that drifted up from below. It carried with it a faint, musty smell that reminded him of his family's storm cellar back home in Missouri. Only, he was fairly certain this led to no simple cellar. "This place smells like a subway," Curtis said, following just behind. The shaft and staircase were located behind the hidden door in the confessional. The good sergeant had initially volunteered to take some men and investigate where it went, but Seifert had strongly protested. He insisted that only he and Walter should go. What was down there was for Walter's eyes only, and the fewer who saw it, the better. Curtis, using his most colorful New York vocabulary, vehemently informed the professor what he thought of that idea, adding that he had the notion to just drop a hand grenade down and take care of any nasty little surprises that might be lurking below. Walter had dismissed the grenade idea, speculating on what would happen if there were any gas pipes or weapons caches down there, but compromised on Seifert's request. He decided that he and Curtis would go down, with Seifert leading the way in case any of those nasty surprises happened to materialize. Because of the cramped space, however, both soldiers were forced to leave their rifles behind and instead had their pistols drawn and ready. "How far down does this go?" Walter asked. "About 15 meters, Seifert replied. "We're almost there." 15 meters? Walter thought nervously. That was almost 3 floors below ground. He leaned over the railing to try and see what, or who, was waiting for them, but the only thing he could make out was Seifert's thin figure as it continued to make its way downward into the darkness. Walter strained to listen for any telltale noises, but the only sound was the professor's footfalls tamping lightly on the stairs. "I don't like this, Lieutenant," Curtis muttered. Admittedly, neither did Walter. Under normal circumstances, he wouldn't have given a prisoner such free range, but after the professor's unexpected appearance from the confessional, the captive Colonel Dieter had become so enraged that he had to be physically restrained. He clearly wanted nothing more than to kill the man, and with his bare hands if necessary. He had yelled in German so loud and so fast that Curtis could only catch fragments of what he was screaming. Most had been cursing, but he distinctly heard the word traitor and something about how the whole of Germany was now lost thanks to him. Walter decided it best to separate the two, and the further away the better. And if the professor was willing to reveal secrets, then by golly, let the man give them a guided tour. Perhaps then they could finally get some answers. "Hey," Walter called down to Seifert. "You still haven't told me how you knew my name. What did you mean you've been waiting for me?" "Indeed," Seifert said. He had stopped at the bottom of the stairs, which ended at a heavy steel door set in the concrete wall, and fished a key from his pocket. "I have something for you." "I'll bet," Curtis said, imagining a squad of German soldiers just waiting on the other side of the door, machine guns raised. Seifert unlocked the door, which groaned as he pushed it open. The stairway was immediately flooded with a bright light, and Walter had to shield his eyes for a moment. Once they adjusted, his mouth fell open in complete surprise. The room beyond was massive, with high cement walls at least 2 stories tall. Every square foot of floor space was filled with rows of machinery, the likes of which he had never seen before. It was a labyrinth of tall metal cabinets, each covered with several rows of glowing vacuum tubes that pulsated in a synchronized rhythm, growing dim to bright, then back again. Electrical cables of all diameters hung vine-like from the ceiling and sprawled out to the many cabinets, feeding the beast the electricity it needed to live. So much for the mystery of the power cables, Walter thought. He still had no idea what he was looking at, though, and continued to stare in awe and bewilderment. The only comparison his mind could make was thinking that it looked like a large city at Christmas time, with every single building decked out for the holidays. Curtis emerged just behind him from the stairs, and upon seeing the vast chamber of glowing components, looked just as dumbfounded as Walter. "Holy smokes!" he gawked. "Who packed up Times Square?" Seyfert motioned for them to follow, and they slowly began to make their way through the maze of cabinets and their thousands of glowing tubes. Walter heard a low hum emanating from them, all growing into a louder chorus with each pulse. Even passing by a few feet away, he could feel the heat radiating off them. It was no wonder this place was underground and ventilated. It would be an absolute oven if it weren't. Seyfert led them to the center of the room, to a small area of workbenches covered in papers and shelves filled with a variety of manuals and textbooks. Large chalkboards stood off to the side, each filled with handwritten mathematical equations and formulas of such mind-numbing complexity that even to Walter's college-educated mind might as well have been ancient hieroglyphics. Walter jumped, startled, when a high-backed office chair suddenly wheeled backwards from amid the clutter. Sitting in it was the pudgy man with the thick mustache he'd seen earlier walking with the professor in the street. "This is Hector, my assistant," Seyfert said. Hector nodded politely, though Walter couldn't respond because he was too awestruck by another object just over the man's shoulder, something he just couldn't believe. Was that gold? The object was, in fact, a golden loop, approximately 12 inches in diameter and easily half an inch thick. It sat upright on a metal base in the middle of a sturdy wooden table and seemed to give off a shimmering golden aura from all the vacuum tubes reflecting off it. At the base, a handful of cloth-wrapped wires snaked off the table and into a nearby cabinet crammed with switches, meters, and dials. Even thicker cables ran from these, presumably to tie into all the other mysterious components about the room. It wasn't hard for Walter to deduce that if the racks of glowing tubes were the orchestra, the gold loop was the conductor. "What is this?" Walter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This," Seyfert said, looking around sadly, "is something that should never have been built." He turned to face Walter and straightened himself. "And now that you have finally arrived, I beg you to destroy it." Colonel Dieter stared somberly at the floor, trying to avoid the occasional glances of the American soldiers standing around the sanctuary. They were all smoking their foul-smelling cigarettes and chatting idly, some grinning and laughing, no doubt making jokes at his expense. He afforded a quick glance around the structure that he and his men had worked so hard to construct. Sadly, the Yankee lieutenant had been correct. They'd been so focused on making it look authentic that they had neglected to make it look used. It had been a foolish mistake, and it disgusted him that the pig had discovered their ruse so easily. Even more disgusting was that the Americans were here at all. Their mere presence in the beloved fatherland confirmed what he and the others had so deeply feared. Germany was about to lose the war. How heartbreaking to be defeated at the hand of these cursed mongrels, and by the pompous, tea-sipping British and the drunken, vodka-swilling Russians. He drew a long, tormented breath. Germany had fought so hard and for so long, had sacrificed too many of its sons to lose to such inferior countries. His tiny hidden outpost had been his country's last great hope. But now, thanks to the blasted traitor Seifert, that too was gone. He swore he would kill the man if given half a chance. Dieter also cursed his superiors. Not only had they denied his repeated requests for more men, but they had actually taken some from him. With 3 armies closing in on their borders, Berlin was desperately scrounging troops to help repel the invaders. Did they not realize that he possessed the one thing that could have won them the war? Obviously not. Otherwise, they would have given him what he needed. Now their foolish oversight was going to cost them everything. The thought incensed him. Obviously, he could not just stand by and let that happen. There was no way he could just sit there like a defeated coward while the most powerful military device in the history of mankind was handed over to their enemy. No, he would instead fulfill his solemn duties as an officer of the Third Reich and prevent such a catastrophe from occurring, no matter what the cost. Keeping his head low, he shifted his gaze only slightly to note where each enemy soldier was, and patiently waited for an opportunity to present itself. Curtis whistled long and low, his eyes wide in disbelief as he examined the gold loop sitting on the table. "Is that made of what I think it is?" When Seifert nodded solemnly, Curtis whistled again. He had never seen so much gold in any single object before, not even in the upscale jewelry shops of Manhattan. "Where'd you get so much gold?" Seifert refrained from answering. Unfortunately, he was all too aware where it had originated from, and he didn't want to think about it. The horrific images haunted him too much already. Visions of captured Jews being held down, squirming as their mouths were pried open so dirty pliers could extract bloody teeth for their gold fillings. The thought made him shudder. He stepped over to one of the bookshelves, reached up and withdrew a book. Then he turned and presented it to Walter. Walter took the book, noting that it appeared to be a novel. The pages were worn with age and use, obviously well read. Walter didn't recognize the German title, Die Zeitmaschine, but he did recognize the author, H.G. Wells. He had read some of his work during his sophomore year, and although baffled by some of the far-fetched dystopian themes, had nonetheless found it a welcome distraction from the tedious textbooks. "A book?" Walter said, confused. Seifert motioned toward the front cover. "Inside." Walter opened it and found tucked inside was a piece of paper neatly folded in half. He took it out, unfolded it, and was shocked to find a handwritten letter addressed to him. "Walter, I know right now you're wondering what the heck is going on, but there's just way too much that's happened for me to write it all down here. But it all started with the gold loop, so whatever you do, do not keep it. You must destroy it. Professor Seifert will explain everything to you, then you'll understand. The war is almost over for us both, and I'll see you again real soon. S.B. P.S. Now I know how you felt about Betty Delaney." Walter was instantly shocked, confused, and more than just a little aggravated. He read the letter again before looking up to glare at Seifert. "What is this?" he demanded. Seifert only shrugged. "A warning. If you will heed it, there's much to explain." Walter gritted his teeth, deeply frustrated. Yes, there sure as hell was a lot of explaining to do, and so far, instead of providing any answers, this professor was only raising more questions. How had this guy known his name? What was this letter all about? Who the hell was S.B., and how in God's name had he known about Betty Delaney? He hadn't even told his closest buddies about her, yet here her name was scribbled down and tucked away like some fortune-teller's trick at a sideshow carnival. "All right," Walter scowled. "What the hell is going on? Who gave you this? I want some answers, mister, and I want them right now." The professor only adjusted his eyeglasses and replied timidly, "I promise I will explain everything. But first, we must destroy all this." Curtis suddenly looked up in surprise. "Destroy it? I don't think so, pal. I don't know what kind of squirrely secret stuff you got going on down here, but this looks too damn important to just be destroyed." It also looked like it was worth a small fortune, but he kept that thought to himself. Truthfully, he couldn't care less about all the tin boxes and their pretty glowing lights. His interests were piqued by the shiny gold loop. He looked over at Walter for confirmation. Walter only appeared to be stuck in the middle of a serious dilemma as he looked around, from Curtis to Seyfert, and finally to the loop. His head was still pounding from the earlier firefight, and now it hurt all the more as he struggled to make sense of things that made absolutely no sense at all. "Before we do anything," Walter said, "I want some answers." The moment Colonel Dieter had been waiting for finally presented itself, when one of his captors, a young corporal by the name of Finelli, decided that Dieter should be tied up. He made a remark about how the Kraut needed to know his ass now belonged to the United States, and after locating some thick twine in a storage closet, stood over him to bind him. Dieter, still bruised and bloodied from both the gunshot wound on his arm and Curtis's pistol butt strike to his head, managed to convincingly feign being woozy and incomprehensive. When Finelli ordered him to raise his hands, he instead pretended to be incoherent. After asking several times, Finelli finally got impatient and reached out for them, making the fatal error of exposing his bayonet from where it hung in a scabbard at his waist. With cat-like agility, Dieter had the bayonet free in a flash. Before the young soldier even knew what was happening, Dieter had buried the blade deep between his ribs, puncturing his left lung and deflating it like a ruptured balloon. Finelli staggered backwards, utterly stunned as he stared at the handle protruding from his side. Blood began to pour down and drip in large crimson spatters on the stone floor. He tried to scream, but found he was unable, the air having left his lungs, never to return. Dieter quickly grabbed Finelli's rifle from where it stood, propped nearby against the wall, and began to fire at the remaining soldiers, who had only just begun to realize something was wrong. He struck one soldier in the neck and sent the others scrambling for cover. Walter and Curtis exchanged looks of alarm when they heard the muffled gunshots echoing down the stairwell, then drew their pistols and began running for the door. "Don't you move!" Walter shouted over his shoulder. The two scientists readily obeyed. They weren't going anywhere. By the time the paratroopers managed to return fire, Dieter was already crouched beside Finelli's body and had removed 2 hand grenades from his waist pouch. He moved surprisingly fast, his body fueled by pure adrenaline, a sense of purpose, and the knowledge that these next few actions were among the last he would perform in his lifetime. He pulled the pin on the first grenade and let the safety lever fall away. Hearing the hiss of the reaction of the detonator inside, he lobbed the heavy cast-iron pineapple toward the American soldiers. It flew over several rows of pews before bouncing off the far wall and skidding along the stone floor. "Grenade!" someone yelled in a loud, panicked voice, and they all instinctively scattered and dove to escape the blast. In doing so, they gave Dieter the time he needed to fulfill his plan. Grasping the second grenade in one hand and Finelli's rifle in the other, he charged toward the confessional. Walter and Curtis were halfway across the room, weaving through the bright cabinet cases, when they heard the muffled explosion of the first grenade up above. Curtis cursed and paused, but Walter continued to run, his thoughts only of his men and what might be happening up there. He was halfway to the door when he was suddenly halted by a succession of gunshots directly in front of him. Rows of vacuum tubes began to explode in a straight line on both sides of him as bullets plowed through the glass. He looked up in horror to see Colonel Dieter standing on the stairs and firing at him through the open door. Both Walter and Curtis instinctively jumped for cover behind the metal racks. Walter leaned around the side to fire back, the concussion of his pistol slamming his eardrums like hammers. Curtis likewise appeared from behind the cabinet a few feet away and began to fire, his bullets joining Walter's as they pinged and zipped about the stairwell like a swarm of deadly hornets. One ricochet caught Dieter in his left thigh and exploded a small hole in his gray pants, which began to run red with blood. Undaunted, Dieter continued to fire the rifle as he hobbled into the room, yelling incomprehensibly in German. Walter and Curtis both ducked behind cover as the projectiles slammed through rows of vacuum tubes and sent shards of shattered glass flying. Sparks exploded as the exposed filaments immediately burned out, filling the air with an acrid smell of melted metal. The hot glass and burning bits of tungsten rained down over Walter, stinging like fire ants as they landed on the back of his bare neck and hands. Ignoring the pain, Walter held still and waited for a break in the firing before peeking around the cabinet to reacquire his target. He was surprised to see Dieter was no longer aiming at either him or Curtis, but instead had drawn a bead on the professor across the room. Seifert and Hector were crouched down behind the large table, holding the loop, like frightened children in a deadly game of hide and seek. Walter quickly lined up his sights on Dieter's chest and squeezed the trigger, firing 3 rounds in rapid succession. Dieter immediately staggered backwards as the shots found their mark. He dropped the rifle and sent it clattering to the floor, then cradled his midsection. Walter was sure he was about to collapse, but he instead only began to fumble with something in his hands. To Walter's horror, he realized too late that the man had just pulled the pin on a hand grenade. "Grenade!" Walter shouted. He fired 2 more shots at Dieter's head in a desperate attempt to drop him before he could throw the grenade, but was unsuccessful. The first shot missed entirely, and the second only sliced through the skin of Dieter's forehead like a scalpel. Dieter, using his last bit of strength, swung his arm around and lobbed the grenade. Walter watched in terror as it arced through the air, seeming to fly in slow motion. Once again, he was surprised to see that neither he nor Curtis were the intended recipient. Instead, the grenade sailed across the room, bounced off a cabinet, and rolled beneath Seifert's and Hector's table. Both men had heard Walter yell his warning, but being scientists instead of soldiers, simply weren't prepared to react. The grenade rolled to a stop in front of them, smoking and hissing as the primer burned its way down to the explosives inside. Only then did it dawn on them that they should try to get away. Helpless to do anything more, Walter dropped behind cover and prayed the grenade was a dud. It wasn't. The thing exploded with enough force to lift the heavy table a foot off the ground and shove back nearby cabinets. The shrapnel shattered every glass vacuum tube and light bulb in a 30-foot radius, instantly plunging the area into an eerie and silent darkness. Walter slowly peeked around the side of the cabinet, his ears once again ringing and eyes stinging from all the smoky haze hanging in the air. He aimed his pistol at Dieter's motionless body, then yelled over his shoulder to Curtis, "You all right?" Curtis coughed as he slowly rose from behind a bookshelf a few feet away. He was bleeding from a few fresh lacerations, but otherwise appeared to be in one piece. "Yeah, just a few more scars for the collection." The two men then rushed over to check on the scientists, their boots crunching on glass as they ran. It was Curtis who reached the heavy table first and, looking behind it, found Hector lying on the ground, or at least what was left of him. He grimaced and looked back to Walter, slowly shaking his head no. Walter found Seyfert lying on his side and curled up in a ball. His suit, so clean and pressed only moments before, was now pockmarked with dark patches of blood that spread out from 100 rips and tears. Walter sighed. He had seen this before, far too many times, and it never ended well. He knelt down and gently turned Seyfert over to cradle his upper torso. "Hey," Walter said softly. "Can you hear me?" Seyfert slowly turned his bloody face to Walter, the red liquid trickling from his ears, nose, and the sides of his mouth. His breathing was labored as he struggled for air, and gurgling noises came from his throat as he gasped in short bursts. His glasses were broken and misaligned on his face, and Walter gingerly removed them. Seyfert's eyes were only partially open, bloodshot and unable to focus. He was barely conscious, but tried to acknowledge the man. His bloody hand clasped Walter's shirt tightly and pulled him closer. "Destroy it," Seyfert managed to whisper. "Destroy it, Walter. For the good of the world and for your..." Seyfert tensed and groaned as some unspeakable pain shot through him. It was as though death's icy hand had clutched and squeezed him. Then he went limp in Walter's arms. Walter stood beside the church, or whatever the structure was, holding the handset of a portable field radio. On the other end was his superior officer, Lieutenant Colonel Grant Jackman, who listened patiently as Walter described what they had found. The major carefully considered his account, incredible as it may have seemed. False doors and hidden workshops were indeed intriguing, but the Nazis had always been sneaky bastards. The more the AEF pushed into Germany, the more their secrets were being revealed. There were already seemingly unbelievable stories of Allied troops finding fenced camps crammed with thousands of Jewish civilians, all walking skeletons, standing half in and out of death's door. He had been sickened to learn that not only had the Nazis been killing them en masse and discarding their bodies in large ovens, but had also reportedly been conducting brutal and inhumane experiments on them. By comparison, a secret workshop in an obscure village was barely enough to raise an eyebrow. "What do you think it is, Lieutenant?" Jackman asked. Walter sighed and ran a hand through his greasy hair, unsure how to answer. Honestly, he didn't have a clue. The note said that Seyfert was supposed to explain everything, but obviously that wasn't going to happen. "I don't know, sir," he finally said. "I think it must be some kind of communications, experimental long range, or maybe an encryption device of some sort. I just can't say for sure." Since everyone who knew anything about the place was dead, all Walter had was guesses. He and a select few men had examined the underground facility for nearly 2 hours following the fight, and the only recognizable item they found was a German two-way radio. This, too, had fallen victim to Dieter's grenade, however, and no longer functioned. Its presence was baffling, since radios did not tend to work well underground, but even more so because it did not appear to be tied into the bizarre machinery at all. As Walter sat and waited for the colonel to reply, his eyes drifted to the mysterious note Seyfert had given him. He had not yet mentioned it to Jackman, nor did he think he would. It just sounded too unbelievable, and he feared the colonel would surely think he was cracking up. He read it again with trepidation, unable to ignore the lines that jumped out at him the most. It all started with the gold loop. Do not keep it. You must destroy it. He wondered why it was so important that the loop be destroyed, and what would happen if he didn't. And who was it that was telling him to do so anyway? Try as he may, he could not think of anyone with the initials SB. Walter rubbed his eyes, then pressed the call button on the radio. What do you advise we do, sir? Do you want us to try and bring any of this stuff back? Or maybe you want to send someone out to come take a look at it? Walter bit his lip in anticipation as he waited for Jackman's decision. Finally, the colonel's voice crackled on the radio once again. What kind of shape's it in? The gold loop wasn't touched, Walter said. They had found it lying on the ground, apparently having been spared from the grenade blast by the heavy table. As for the rest, whatever made it work is pretty much just scrap metal at this point. There were a few more moments of silence on the other end as Jackman considered this. Then he finally answered, Blow it. Sir? Walter asked, wanting to make sure he had heard correctly. Blow the damn thing. If it is for communication, I want it gone. The last thing we need are some Nazi diehards jabbering away to each other and prolonging the war. Walter let out the breath he'd been holding, filled with a sense of relief. He was off the hook, having just gotten an official order to destroy the gold loop. Yes, sir, he said. Acknowledged. Consider it gone. Walter slowly descended the spiral stairs, his flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the dark. The area was almost completely black now, the main power having been disconnected for fear the broken equipment might start a fire or accidentally electrocute someone. The only ambient light was a marginal stream that came from a large open hatch in the ceiling, apparently used during construction to lower the bulky machinery down. He entered the large room and slowly shone his light around. Most of the machinery was in disarray, riddled with bullet holes, covered in broken glass, overturned outright. Now that the power was off, it was eerily quiet, a feeling made worse when Walter's flashlight panned across the pale face of the dead colonel, staring back at him from the floor. His body lay where it had fallen, in a pool of coagulated blood. Walter grunted sourly. It wasn't the first man he had killed. He just hoped he would be one of the last. The Geneva Convention mandated that dead enemy combatants be identified, their deaths reported, and their bodies be returned, if possible. If not, they were to be buried and the location recorded for possible exhumation. Walter would certainly obey these rules, at least technically. The body, as well as the ones upstairs, would technically be buried when the church was exploded and caved in. This underground room would become their tomb, and if someone wanted to dig them up later, well, good luck with that. As for the two scientists, Walter decided they would receive proper burials. Getting them topside had been a chore none of them enjoyed, especially with the eviscerated Hector, who they had to wrap in a blanket. Walter regretted not being able to do more for them, but he simply had no idea who to inform of their passing. A search of their personal quarters, located in one of the townhouses down the street, revealed very little. The Germans had obviously placed heavy restrictions on them. No phones, no radios, no letters to or from home. The only personal item they had located was a photo of Seyfert standing with a beautiful, dark-haired woman, and a pigtailed little girl in a flower-patterned dress. Walter wished he could let them know he wasn't coming home, but in the end, all he could do was log the name Professor Eric Seifert and the location of his body. Poor Hector was not even afforded that dignity, being logged only as Hector, LNU, last name unknown. Walter had them both buried with as much dignity as possible in the local cemetery, and hoped that someday someone would come to claim them. Walter walked to the center of the room, where he found Curtis digging through debris beside the wooden table. It had been cracked during the grenade blast, but managed to maintain its integrity. He turned when Walter's light came into view. "Hey, Walt," he greeted. Protocol dictated that the enlisted man should address his superior by rank, but the two had long since developed an unwritten rule that there was no need for such nonsense when no one else was around. "I need you to get topside," Walter said. "Help King start rigging the building." "We're blowing it?" Curtis asked, surprised. Walter nodded, and Curtis stared at him a moment in disbelief. "All of it?" Walter raised an eyebrow as if to ask what else he could have possibly meant. Curtis nodded toward the gold loop, which he had since returned to its upright position on the table. Walter looked at it and marveled. Even in the relative dark, covered in soot and dust, it was beautiful, the flashlight reflections casting shimmering golden waves all around. "I think it's solid gold," Curtis said, carefully wiping away the dust. "Feel how heavy it is." Walter only shrugged as if to say he didn't care how heavy the damn thing was, then held up his hands as if to ask what difference it made. Curtis grinned sheepishly. "Well, might make a heck of a souvenir, if you know what I mean." Walter certainly did know what he meant, and scowled in disapproval. "I don't care if it's made from Hitler's molars and encrusted with diamonds from King Solomon's outhouse. We have our orders, Sergeant. Now get with King and rig the place. I want out of here before dark." Walter turned sharply and walked away, leaving a very disappointed Curtis to stare longingly at the wondrous trophy he'd just been denied. Walter watched as two of his men finished stringing a spool of electrical wire from the church to their position a safe distance away. He found this rather ironic, considering it had been electrical wires that had revealed the building to him. Now they were about to cause its destruction. One of the soldiers, a private named King, cranked up the internal spring on a detonator, while another, a corporal named Bell, carefully stripped the cloth off the ends of the wires. Afterward, they wound the exposed copper to the terminals of the detonator, tightened the screws, and gave Walter a thumbs up. "We're hot, sir," King said. "On your word." Walter did a quick head count to make sure everyone was accounted for, then returned the thumbs up. All the men began to hunker down, plugging their ears with their fingers as they stared at the building in eager anticipation. Even after all the explosions they'd seen throughout the last few years, there was still something strangely satisfying about watching things blow up. They were like boys with firecrackers, only now their cherry bombs could take down entire neighborhoods. Walter then looked back to the building one last time. He had to hand it to the Germans. The church facade had actually been a pretty good idea. The remote location kept it away from prying eyes, and if any enemy planes happened to fly overhead, it just appeared like any other house of worship. Not to mention, the steeple had the added bonus of acting as a lookout platform. The only thing they did wrong was not anticipating the American paratroopers, or Walter's keen sense of observation. Walter nodded to Bell, who checked to make sure the target area was devoid of any human life by barking the word, "Clear!" in 3 different directions. Then he inserted the metal handle into the detonator and gave it a quick twist. Inside, the tension spring quickly unwound, activating the tiny generator. The electrical charge it produced raced down the wires to the Composition B explosive compound they had affixed to strategic points throughout the building. The structure almost instantaneously exploded in an eruption of wood, stone, and dust that flew skyward at a few thousand feet per second. The shockwave came a moment later, a barreling thud that reverberated through their bodies as though they'd been struck in the chest by the fist of an invisible giant. Some of the men cheered, while others laughed. It was just another day at work, and they had not only survived, but had emerged victorious. Walter watched as the structure collapsed inward with the cracking of splinting timber. Patches of dark smoke began to drift upward as small fires started, took hold, and grew. It wasn't long before the remains of the building were fully engulfed in a hungry blaze. Walter took solace, knowing that the mysterious components below would be nothing but melted globs of metal buried beneath tons of debris. He also took comfort in knowing that likewise destroyed was the handwritten letter addressed to him. He had placed it in Seyfert's book, which he had returned to the shelf. Now he felt a deep sense of relief. Both the letter and Seifert had warned him to destroy the loop, and he had done so. He drew a deep sigh and turned to his men, ready to leave the whole cursed place behind. "Gear up," he ordered. "We're moving out." His men did as they were instructed, each grabbing their packs and weapons and slinging them over their shoulders as they followed their leader. All except one. Sergeant Curtis Maxwell was crouched down well away from the others and glanced around to make sure no one was looking. Then he picked up a round, heavy object wrapped in cloth from where it was concealed behind a tree. He quickly shoved it into his pack before anyone could see it, and then hefted the pack onto his back. The straps dug deep into his shoulders from such a heavy load, but it was an encumbrance he was willing to live with. He had plans of opening a restaurant when he returned to the States, and that much gold would set him up nicely. After all the death and pain and destruction he'd been party to over the last 2 years, he didn't think it too much to ask. He adjusted the pack, then jogged to catch up with the rest of his unit.